Okay, we're going to do some, well, it's not really different. I want to go and work off of what a lot of you were using for your critical thinking paper. Seems like there was a huge amount of interest or relative interest in this issue of sort of visual augmented realities, or I should say virtual augmented realities, in part probably because of the videos you saw. So what I want to do is I want to sort of walk you through some of the real sort of useful parts, and also bring up some of the paradoxes we have in anthropology right now looking at a lot of this, and especially with things like Second Life. So first off, let's take a look at this. Stop the share and switch. I can't recommend too strongly. You should definitely take a look at this. It's a hugely, especially for this class, incredibly useful resource. This is your Miller. This is the same Daniel Miller. This is the project they were doing for about, I think, 6 or 8 years. I mean, he's still doing something sort of related to this, looking specific at, I think, English rural life. But this was a huge project they did at University College London called Why We Post. So what they were looking at is, and again, this is the basic part of I think that video you guys saw, but also a lot of the work that he's done since before and since then has to do with this whole issue of the fact that there's cultural variation in social media. Social media doesn't drive culture. Social media gets used by cultures and gets used by very different ways. A couple of you mentioned his Trinidad study. This is the easiest and best accessible place I know of in terms of finding all this. This is all their materials that they found. There's an absolutely superb number of videos, including the various things they found in the project, because they went and looked at a bunch of different sites, looking at social media used in all these things you see in yellow here in all these different countries. And it's an absolutely fascinating study. It's very, very well done. It's classic anthropology, participant observation, in a bunch of very, very diverse places. In many cases, you'd sort of wonder how you can compare them. So I strongly recommend you get a chance, go through these discoveries. There's, I think, 12. They've gone and actually, everyone's individual research was actually written up as a sort of a short, not really a book, sort of like a large article. They've also got a couple of summary works. And they've got a whole series of really fascinating videos that they've done, which I think pop up here. Let's see what happens. Yeah. So what actually happens, they have a whole set of videos about how they did each of these places and things they found. So it's what I'd call classic anthropology, but done in the 21st century. And each individual actually did sort of a set of small edited versions of the things that they thought were critical. It's like you take notes. These are like video notes of what they saw in their location. She was looking at folks in industrial South China, in Zhejiang province, I think. So, and all these different locations have, they're looking at different things, but very much in the same context. He was looking specifically at the one here in England. So, things about how media changes kids' relationships. Some real discussion was how they did the ethnography in England. In fact, they all talk about the different issues about doing ethnographies in different locations, but also really fascinating things about how different places are using the same media. So the media is not changing. So it's all Twitter, Facebook, etc. But what they look at and what they show you evidence of is how each society takes the same platform of social media and uses it in very different ways that in some cases are new, but in most cases reinforce social attitudes and values just played out in a new context. A couple of you were mentioning this whole thing of cancel, which is now real popular, at least one or two of the video threads, or media threads. But what's really interesting is I can guarantee you wouldn't find that in other societies. The idea of cancel, like you cancel someone or cancel something, is going to be found in related societies where individualism is a big thing. But you're not going to find it in other societies because the social consequences of saying that would be so dramatic that it would not be acceptable. So, what they were looking at is Why We Post. They've got this clever little, Why We Post project sort of summary here. There's a tremendous amount of research in this thing. It's all very, very accessible, absolutely fascinating. And so it's an absolutely wonderful resource for a bunch of things. If you want to, you can actually get your master's degree in this particular area now. University College London actually has an online master's program looking at digital anthropology, which I think Miller's still in charge of. So there's obviously huge potential in this, for not only research, but also just career-wise. Because not surprising, a lot of your social media companies are absolutely fascinated with the way this stuff gets played out because they don't do this research. I'm going to attach well, I'm not going to attach, but right after this, I'll include a link to a short video I want you to watch called Instalie, which is a real clever video that was done a number of years ago on this sort of topic. One of the other things that I really want to take a look at, in fact, here, let me stop this. Let me do this real quick. Sorry for that. I was trying to fish up something different. What you actually see here, I've just sort of frozen this in YouTube, is that Second Life is a puzzle because it's, on one hand, it fits what Miller's talking about, but it also, as Wollerstorff found when he was originally looking at it, there's also sort of a weird counterintuitive pattern to Second Life. And again, Second Life is really interesting because everything you see here was built by the users. The company that owns it doesn't build it. So everything you see here was built by users. You have to be a real person to be in Second Life. Theoretically, you have to be over 18 years of age. So everyone, hypothetically, and of course, with limits, everyone here is an adult. You don't know where they're from. It uses Google Translate, so you got a lot of different languages at any one time. But one of the main factors in Second Life is people hang out with other people. So it serves a social function, which is probably why it's still around after almost 20 years. One of the really fascinating aspects of this is because the company that owns Second Life came from a very sort of libertarian background, there's basically almost no rules in Second Life. So reefing, which is a term that's used in a lot of areas, but I think might have originally started in Second Life, was a real common, and still is a real common problem where someone suddenly comes in and makes a mess of the whole thing by intentionally trying to screw up this sort of dance party, whatever it is. So what you find is one of the real interesting aspects of Second Life is that very early on, and this has persisted in very consistent ways, and I haven't seen any work done on this, is you find that people, though they're coming from different places, so if they're theoretically, and of course in many cases they're from different cultures, find themselves in a virtual world where sort of anything goes, almost literally. One of the first things they tend to do after, making relationships or, getting to know people and then coming up to a place like this, is they start setting up rules. And as Wollerstorff notes in his work on Second Life, what's really interesting is how quickly they set up a set of normative behavior patterns. And in many cases, for example, when you go into a lot of these areas, there's actually behavior patterns. I'm not sure if it's true here in terms of how you can dress and what you're supposed to look like. Since you can dress in anything and pretty much look like anything in Second Life, it's just changing your avatar. But there's very strict sort of like stylistic dress codes. There's very strict ways that you behave, how you're supposed to do stuff. And these are very rigidly enforced. And so what you find in a real interesting way in Second Life is that you have the development of many ways, which you can almost call incipient cultures in terms of coalesced normative group behaviors generated by people that already live within a culture from somewhere. I mean, you have no idea where these, 5 or 6 people are actually from. But you find that in Second Life, if they do stuff together, which you would assume since they're all here at one spot, that they have agreed upon a set of rules, a set of norms in terms of how they're going to act, how they're going to interact with each other. Maybe if you're here, you have to have, coded in dance moves that your character is doing that looks like this guy's not playing the game. So in that situation, there's ways that you have to do, but the fascinating thing is it's done by the members. There are no rules to Second Life. The rules are generated by groups in Second Life. And so the threat, in a very classical way in anthropology, is if you want to remain part of this group, if you don't want to be ostracized, you follow the rules, you follow the normative patterns. And what's really interesting is, given the fact that you have a number of folks that have been in Second Life for over 10 years, is the large number of normative groups that have persisted over a very long period of time in a digital world that has no reality. This is something that at some point people are going to have to start taking a really long look at, because again, as I think I might have mentioned before, one of the really intriguing aspects of Second Life is the bugger's been around for a really long time. Second Life started long before Facebook ever was around, long before Twitter was ever even an idea. So all these social media that you guys were looking at and that we talk about and Miller examines post-date this. And in many ways it becomes sort of interesting, since in other ways Second Life has turned out to be a pretty good sort of predictor for digital social behavior. Whether this is also going to be the case, that you actually have within culture groups, people have subgroups, which in very, very short periods of time, you have to remember most of this stuff in Second Life is developed within, say, a year or two. And these folks aren't hanging out in this 24/7. They're there for maybe an hour or two per day. They're still building very complex normative-based behavior packages that are tied to particular locations, tied to particular activities or interest or whatever it might be, that then persist through time, even though it's a good bet that some of these people have only been in world for, maybe a couple of months or something like that. In fact, I think the guy that's posting this, whoever this guy is, Yorkie, whoever that is, actually left Second Life for a number of years and just came back recently. So what you have is you have sort of a persistent social group, even though the members are changing. You have a persistent social group, even though the location's entirely digital, and I'm sure has changed, since almost nothing in Second Life is the same as it was 10 years ago. So what you've got is the persistency of socially accepted patterns of behavior. It can be really, really durable, and yet can get built or constructed and accepted in very, very short periods of time. This isn't the traditional way that anthropology sees cultures and groups. Anthropology traditionally sees cultures and groups as being a very long-term process, that groups slowly develop over time and groups develop normative patterns over time. And then people are sort of, in the conservative nature of culture, people keep to these patterns and persist through generations of activities doing these things. Second Life brings a lot of that into question because it just hasn't been around very long. And yet in a lot of these areas, there's whole groups. There's one called, I think, furries. There's another ones that folks that's like elves and stuff like that. There's real rigid. You cannot access their areas unless you actually accept. They actually have like posted list of behaviors. And you actually carry a thing around with you that if you break any of those behaviors, it throws you out of that part of the sim. So you can't be there unless you behave. And if you want to join the group, the members of the group actually will decide by vote or however to accept you as a member or not. So you've got all the manifestations of what you would see as sort of group social cultural norms generated in a virtual digital space under very short periods of time. And yet they're very durable and persistent, despite the changing membership and the fact that this world has changed in an enormous number of ways in its last 20 years of existence. That is an enormously fascinating area of anthropology that has yet to be studied. So on one hand, you have Miller's work, which sort of shows the fact that from culture to culture, digital aspects can actually just be used as tools for engaging in existing cultural patterns. Bohlersdorf's work and some of the other work done in Second Life suggests that there's also sort of an opposite trend to that, that if people in cultures decide to engage in some other form of social cultural activity, they will still build something that looks like a culture in that new location, in that new city, in that new venue, and with people will build situations. And one of the things that's rather surrealistic in Second Life is the number of relationships you actually see where people marry folks in Second Life. There's a creepy, well, I shouldn't say creepy, it's a judgment call, but there's a very fascinating thing that we're going to see later this semester in a place called Pleasantville, where you actually raise a family. So you have adults who, no, I'm not going to spoil it, just to see it later. So you have sort of a digital family life in a digital family town. So in fact, it actually predates the TV show, but I think there was a TV show based on Pleasantville or something like that, I can't remember. So anyway, so what you have is you have this fascinating use of the ideas of culture, other ideas of reality to a certain extent, based on a digital platform that people engage into entirely by choice. You don't have to, as I think I mentioned before, you don't have to actually pay anything to play Second Life. It's free to play, though you have to have the computer to play it on. So you can be part of this community for no explicit cost. But you will have all sorts of social costs if you want to be part of a community in terms of behaving the way the group expects. A fascinating example of the complexity of social relationships and self-policing in what appears to be a free-form, free-for-all digital world. So what it sort of suggests is that if you give people the opportunity to be anything, they're not going to do that. The vast majority of them are going to want structure. They're going to want a social network. They're going to want a social system. They're going to want a set of rules and norms that they have and they expect others to follow. and those folks will somehow sort of coalesce and form a place where you can socialize and dance and do stuff, even if it is entirely digital and you log on. So one of the interesting aspects of studying anthropology in the 2020s is we don't understand how all these areas sort of mix or interact, or they're obviously not in conflict with each other, but at the same time, they don't seem to be really looking at. It just goes to show that culture is a much more complex thing than we thought it was, say, back 20 or 30 years ago, when you would teach a course in anthropology, talking about Japanese culture or Chinese culture, and you had sort of staid, structured patterns of behavior that were fairly predictable and existed in a fairly structured setting. You're also going to see this in the video that I'm posting for you guys to watch on Japanese robots, which gives, because some of you were looking at this whole issue sort of robotics and whether people can accept empathic robots. And so one of the things I wanted to sort of give you is the cultural context for robotic acceptance in Japan, which is based on Japanese cultural values. The fact that you see very discrete populations in Second Life, you see some cultures will have relatively percentage large numbers in Second Life, other cultures basically none. So then again, that's nothing that's ever been studied yet. So just exactly which, I suppose maybe you want to call real world cultures people live in that they find something like Second Life to be maybe an interesting alternative or an acceptable alternative or whatever, varies very much from one place to the other. Japanese are in Second Life, but not in huge numbers, which is sort of interesting. There's more Koreans, I suspect, probably in Second Life than Japanese, but neither group's really highly visible. Brazilians are very visible in Second Life. Some other groups, for example, Danes and the Dutch, I think, are really visible in Second Life and been in there since the beginning. Americans are sort of, but not hugely, about 20–25%. I believe Canadians around 5 or 10%. So there's some things that would sort of, you can extrapolate from them, but then you look at the other groups and all of a sudden all those bets are off. So looking at digital anthropology and sort of the digital studies in anthropology is sort of intriguing because you go in a bunch of different directions, most of which are so recent that we don't really have any answers. We can post the questions like I am right now, but we can't tell you the whys because we don't really understand it yet. And to be honest, if you're in Second Life, I suspect the folks in Second Life don't really care. They're just in there because they can feel like they're part of a group. They like the idea of a set of ruled, structured behaviors, and that makes them feel a part of something. But if you want to see this in Second Life, Google furries, F-U-R-R-I-E-S. In fact, here, let's very quickly do something if this will pop up for you guys. Yeah, so there's just a ton of this stuff. Some of which are fairly straightforward, some of which are just sort of goofy. In the sense of this guy, he's just got too much free time, I think. But nonetheless, what you see is this, sort of this whole subgroup that has its own set of very rigid rules in terms of how you dress or how you dress make your avatar look, and especially social behaviors. I remember with furries, it's supposed to be really, really structured. In fact, this one might be a really fascinating one to look at. So again, you find these subgroups, they have their own set of normative behavior patterns that they expect, members to follow. And yet invented in an incredibly short period of time and not based in any other context. There's not, the idea of furries, things that have tail, I think it's tails and ears in Second Life. As far as I know, that doesn't actually come from some other genre in the way that it's expressed in Second Life. So therefore, this whole thing had to be sort of built by a collective of people, defined by a collective of people, accepted by a collective of people. Now it's persisting through time with a collective of people, but in many cases, I can guarantee it's not the same people. So in some cases, one of the striking things in Second Life started to finish with is in the work that I've seen and the work that I've done, is that when you talk to folks in Second Life, they point out that everything's accelerated. So the argument that folks have in Second Life is a year in Second Life is like 3 to 5 years in the real world. Spending a week in Second Life off and on is like spending a couple of months to 6 months in the real world. So they see everything from social interaction to emotions to everything as being accelerated and sort of fast forwarded when you're in Second Life. I've seen no use of that insight into social media, but given the fact that some of you were looking at the stressors in social media, one would wonder whether it's a similar phenomenon. that because of the way social and digital media engage with us, dude, it actually sort of amps up our sensitivity, and our sense of time sort of collapses as it was. Again, entirely hypothetical, just my points of view, and I have nothing to back it with except sort of just time spent watching things in Second Life.